On the 7th of September, 1936, in a cramped enclosure at a zoo in Hobart, the last known thylacine died. It had, by most accounts, been shut out of its shelter overnight and left exposed to the cold, and one morning it was simply gone. The very last of its kind, dead of neglect, in a cage. No one filmed the moment. No one marked it. There was no ceremony, no headline, no crowd. Just a keeper finding a stiff, striped body on the floor of a cage the next day. The animal that had prowled this continent for millions of years slipped out of existence in a suburban zoo, and the world barely noticed. Its passing came just 59 days after the species had finally, belatedly, been granted legal protection. 59 days too late. And that should have been the end of the story. A clean, tragic full stop. An animal driven to extinction, gone, filed away in the museum drawer of things Australia used to have. Except it wasn't the end. Because in the 90 years since that morning in Hobart, people across Tasmania and the mainland have never stopped reporting the same thing. A stiff-tailed, striped shape crossing a road at night, standing frozen in a spotlight, slipping into the bush. More than 1,000 sightings. 9 decades of them. And now, in a laboratory, scientists are attempting something that would have sounded like pure fantasy a generation ago. To bring the thylacine back from the dead. This is Ancient Aussie History, where we go looking for the parts of this country most people never find, and the ancient story most of us were never taught in school. Subscribe now, and if you'd rather listen, every episode is also a podcast on Spotify, link below. And leave a comment telling me whether you think there's any chance one is still out there, right now, in the Tasmanian wilderness. Because by the end of this, I don't think the answer is as simple as the history books make it sound. The animal we lost. Start with what the thylacine actually was, because most people picture it wrong. It was not a tiger, and it was not a dog, though it looked like a strange blend of both. It was a marsupial, a pouched mammal, more closely related to a kangaroo or a Tasmanian devil than to anything in the dog family, that through the slow work of evolution had come to resemble a wolf almost exactly. Sandy, yellowish-brown fur, a long, stiff tail that it held out rigid like a kangaroo's, and, across its lower back and rump, a series of dark stripes, 13 to 20 of them, that gave it the tiger half of its name. It had features that no dog ever had. Its jaws could open to an astonishing gape, close to 90 degrees, wider than almost any other mammal on Earth. Both males and females carried a pouch. The female to raise her young, the male with a backward-facing pouch to protect himself as he moved through the scrub. It was largely nocturnal, a patient ambush predator that hunted the forests and grasslands by night. And it was, by every account of those who saw it alive, oddly quiet and shy. A retiring animal that wanted very little to do with people, right up until people decided it had to die. Gone from the mainland long before. Here is the first thing the extinct in 1,936 inches story leaves out. The thylacine did not begin its disappearance with European settlement. On the Australian mainland, it had already been gone for thousands of years, vanishing somewhere in the vicinity of 2,000 to 3,000 years ago across the whole continent in what may be one of the great, quiet extinctions of Australian prehistory. The leading explanation is one you'll recognise if you know your Australian animals: the dingo. When the dingo arrived on the mainland, it brought direct competition. A fast, pack-capable predator hunting the same prey. And the thylacine, a solitary hunter, appears to have lost. Add a growing human population and a shifting climate, and the marsupial wolf was squeezed off the mainland entirely. And we know, for certain, that Aboriginal people lived alongside it, because they left us pictures of it. Across the north of the continent, in the rock art of places like Arnhem Land and the Kimberley, and among the ancient engravings of Murujuga in the Pilbara, there are unmistakable images of the thylacine. The sloping back, the stiff tail, and, in some, the distinctive stripes, drawn from life by people who watched the animal move through their country thousands of years ago. Those rock art thylacines are, in a real sense, a portrait gallery of an animal that most of the continent forgot, carved and painted while it was still alive on the mainland, and left behind long after it was gone. The people of this land recorded the Thylacine's existence millennia before a European ever set eyes on one in Tasmania. But it survived in one place, Tasmania, cut off by the rising sea at the end of the Ice Age, and, crucially, a place the dingo never reached. On that island, with no dingoes and few people, the Thylacine held on. For thousands of years after it had vanished from every other part of the continent, Tasmania remained its last stronghold, which means the animal that died in that Hobart cage in 1936 was not just the last of a species, it was the last survivor of a lineage that had already been driven off an entire continent once before. How we killed the last of them. If you've made it this far, here's the part that ties it all together, and it's the part that should make you angry. Subscribe now if you want more of this series, because the extinction of the Thylacine was not a mystery or an accident. It was a policy. When European settlers brought sheep to Tasmania, the Thylacine got the blame for killing them. A reputation that was, we now know, wildly exaggerated. Wild dogs and poor husbandry accounted for far more losses than the Thylacine ever did. But the story stuck, and it was profitable to believe. From 1888, the Tasmanian government paid a bounty. £1 for every adult thylacine killed, 10 shillings for a pup. And over roughly 20 years, more than 2,000 of these bounties were paid out. 2,000 animals, from a population that was never large to begin with, hunted down and handed in for cash, one carcass at a time. By the time the bounty scheme ended in 1909, the Thylacine was already collapsing. Trapping and shooting had gutted the population, and a suspected disease, something like distemper, swept through what remained and finished much of the rest. By the 1920s and 1930s, they had become genuinely rare. And in one of the bleakest ironies in the history of Australian wildlife, the government only granted the Thylacine legal protection in July of 1936. A species-saving law passed 59 days before the last known individual died, alone and cold, in a zoo. We hunted it to the edge on purpose, and then protected it exactly too late to matter, the sightings that never stopped. And this is where the clean story falls apart. Because extinction is supposed to be final, and the Thylacine has never quite agreed to stay dead. Officially, the species was declared extinct decades after 1936. Unofficially, the reports have never stopped. Since that last zoo death, more than 1,000 Thylacine sightings have been recorded. Some in the remote forests of northwestern Tasmania, others, more startlingly, on the mainland, in Victoria and further afield, where the animal supposedly vanished thousands of years ago. Most of these, it must be said honestly, are almost certainly mistaken. A dog seen at a distance, a fox with mange, a wallaby in bad light, wishful eyes turning an ordinary shape into an extraordinary one. Skeptics point this out, and they are right to. But not all of the reports are so easily dismissed. Some come from experienced bushmen, park rangers, and people who knew the local wildlife intimately and insisted that what they saw, the stiff tail, the stripes, the strange stiff gait, was nothing they had a name for. When researchers at the University of Tasmania gathered and analysed more than 1,000 of these records and ran them through statistical extinction modelling, their work suggested something uncomfortable for the tidy 1936 date. That the Thylacine may well have survived, in small numbers in the Tasmanian wilderness, for decades longer than the official record allows, quite possibly into the 1980s, and by some models later still. The species may have been functionally gone. But the exact moment the very last one died is, genuinely, not something anyone can prove. The animal that refuses to fade. There is a reason the Thylacine haunts the Australian imagination the way it does. And it isn't only the sightings. It's that we have just enough of it to feel the loss sharply. There is haunting black and white film footage, shot in the 1930s, of one of the last captive thylacines pacing its enclosure, turning and opening those enormous jaws in a wide, slow yawn. It is a few flickering seconds of a living animal that no longer exists, and almost everyone who watches it feels the same thing. This was recent. This was not a dinosaur, not some creature from the deep past. This was an animal that shared the 20th century with our grandparents, filmed on a movie camera, and we let it go. The thylacine became, in death, the emblem of the very island that killed it. Its image now on the Tasmanian coat of arms, on the state's number plates, on beer labels and tourism logos. A national day of mourning for lost species, National Threatened Species Day, is held every year on the 7th of September, the anniversary of that last death in Hobart. An animal we could not be bothered to save while it lived has become one of the most recognisable symbols in the country now that it's gone. Bringing it back. And that brings us to the strangest chapter of all, the one that would have been science fiction when this story began, because a company is now seriously trying to bring the thylacine back from extinction. The effort, led by the American firm Colossal Biosciences in partnership with Australian scientist Andrew Pask at the University of Melbourne, aims to use genetic engineering to reconstruct the thylacine and reintroduce it to Tasmania. And the progress has been startling. Working from preserved specimens, including a remarkable 110-year-old thylacine head that had been sitting, skinned and preserved in ethanol in a cupboard at Museums Victoria in Melbourne, and which astonishingly still held fragile RNA from the animal's tongue, brain and eye. Researchers reported by late 2024 that they had reconstructed the thylacine genome to over 99.9%, and by 2025, a complete, high-quality genome. The plan is to edit that blueprint into the cells of a living marsupial relative, a small creature called the fat-tailed dunnart, and, step by step, engineer an animal as close to the thylacine as modern science can manage. Whether it will truly work, whether what emerges would be a genuine thylacine or an approximation wearing its shape, is fiercely debated, and it's fair to be skeptical. Critics argue that even a successful animal would be a genetically engineered stand-in rather than the true species, that the money might be better spent saving the marsupials we still have, and that an ecosystem changed over 90 years may no longer have a place to put it. Supporters counter that the thylacine was a keystone predator whose loss left a hole in the Tasmanian bush, that the techniques developed will help conservation more broadly, and that if we drove the animal out on purpose, we bear some responsibility for trying to undo it. Both sides have a point, and the debate is far from settled. But it means this story now has an ending nobody could have predicted. An animal we hunted to extinction on purpose, mourned as a symbol, and half refused to believe was ever truly gone, is now the subject of one of the most ambitious attempts at resurrection in the history of biology. What remains? None of this needs embellishment to be extraordinary, and it's worth being grounded about where the truth actually sits. The honest position is this: the thylacine is, by every scientific measure, extinct. No verified living specimen, no photograph, no body has ever been produced, and the overwhelming likelihood is that the last one really did die decades ago. Anyone who tells you there is definitely a breeding population out there in the Tasmanian scrub is claiming far more than the evidence supports. But anyone who tells you the case is airtight is doing the same. Because we cannot say with certainty when the last thylacine drew its final breath, the modelling pushes it well past 1936. And because more than 1,000 people, many of them careful observers, have insisted for 90 years that they saw something the record says cannot exist. And now, in a laboratory in Melbourne, its genome sits reassembled, waiting. The thylacine is the story of an animal that Australia had, and blamed, and hunted, and lost, and could not save, and then could not stop looking for, out there in the dark, at the edge of the headlights. Whether it is truly gone, or clinging on unseen, or about to be pulled back from the void by the same species that erased it, The marsupial wolf has never quite let this country close the book on it. And perhaps, given what we did to it, it shouldn't. If this is the kind of unresolved Australian story you want more of, leave it in the comments. And subscribe to Ancient Aussie History for more of the strange, ancient, and unresolved corners of this country hiding in plain sight.